spiel on the history behind it or the lead up to it, simply because that's what we've been doing. So we'll just get started here. My first question is that as we talk about the kingdom splitting and we talk about the things that cause that, the first thing that you have to look at is Solomon. And I know we've talked about it, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask you if any of you, before we read it, have a memory of why the kingdom split. Absolutely, because he wasn't worshiping God wholly. What had he done specifically that caused God to be angry with him? Okay, we talked about that, that's one of the things he's kind of famous for, isn't it? He had, 700 wives, 300 concubines. He married a bunch of foreign women, and that was specifically in opposition to what God wanted to have happen. And of course, God had warned the Israelites throughout their time why you don't need to marry foreign women. Is it because they're foreign women? It's not because of the women, it's because of their religion, isn't it? Okay, and so God was not happy because he knew that when you let these people into your life and you marry them, and of course if you've got any kind of, I can't imagine having a relationship with 1,000 women. That's crazy. And I don't know how that works, but I mean, if he had surely had a favorite one or two that he enjoyed being around more than others, but I would think that those ladies, obviously they had an influence on him, so he had a relationship with some of them. But that's what God had told him, is not to marry these foreign women. And it's because they bring with them their foreign gods. And so let's read let me start over. Let's read 1 Kings chapter 11, and let's read verses 1 through 8. It says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh." And I'm going to stop right there for a second, because as I was studying this week, one of the things I came across was a Jewish history website that was written by some practicing Jews, and they were talking about that the worst thing he did was marry the daughter of Pharaoh. And they feel like that was the worst one because it's pointed out in God at the very beginning here. It's almost like they said that God went through a list, said he married many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, and then it goes through all these different people that he married, but for some reason they're stuck on I don't know if that's because of the history that they had there between Egypt and the Israelites, but I just thought that was interesting. So I'm sorry, I interrupted scripture. Let me get back to it. "As well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is the east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So you can kind of see the pattern. And I mean, there's no words minced here. God specifically says, don't marry the foreign women, because surely they will, what's it say in verse 2? Is it verse 2? Yeah, verse 2. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Just over and over through Scripture, the Israelites are like a teenager, aren't they? They just don't listen to their parents. And they don't listen to God. And I mean, it's not like he cloaked it. It's not like he hid it from them and said, hey, there might be some things that are going to happen here that won't be good. He said flat out, if you do this, this will happen. Solomon chose to do it anyway. And I've always thought that's interesting, since Solomon prayed for wisdom and was granted wisdom, and apparently had the ability to make decisions and to be discerning in matters of the law. And yet in matters of the heart and relationships, apparently he didn't have quite the wisdom that he had in other areas, because he was stupid. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Verse 4 says specifically, what's verse 4 say specifically? It happened mainly when? When he was older. When he was older. He got old, and of course I'm going to speculate and just say, the older he got and the more wives he got, the more he was like, I'm not going to fight this. Go build your temple over here. Go build your altar over there. Go do your thing. I don't know. That may not be true. But it does say that in his older age that he began to give in more. And so I think you're right, Jesse. It didn't happen all at once, did it? Well, it can't happen all at once. You got 700 wives. It's got to be a process. Oh, absolutely. Kings throughout history have had wives that were also power hungry, not just the kings themselves. And we know throughout history that the wife or the queen plays, and in this case princesses, can play a big role in manipulating the people around them. And that we've read stories about mothers who wanted their son to be king, and just all the mischievous and devious things they've done to gain power. And so I don't know. Go ahead. Yep. And if y'all couldn't hear him, he was talking about when you get with the pigs, you're going to get filthy. That's kind of, and that overcame Solomon. And as we do all this conversation, I want to always come back to the fact that Solomon can make his own decisions. You can blame 1,000 women, but it still falls on Solomon, doesn't it? Because God told Solomon, and Solomon made a choice. How did God punish Solomon? So we read what he's done. Now, how did God was displeased, so what did God do to him? He took his kingdom away, didn't he? He told him, look, I'm not going to take it away from you, but I am going to take it away from your descendants. So let's read it instead of just me trying to quote it. Let's see. Verses 9 through 13. 1 Kings 11, 9 through 13. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, and I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, whom I have chosen. And so, why did God leave Solomon after doing exactly what God told him not to do? And it says here, who appeared to him twice. So it's not like he just told him once, is it? He appeared to him twice over time. So it's not like Solomon didn't have some relationship with God, and that we know that Solomon had been a good follower in the beginning. He asked for wisdom. He asked for the right things, and God blessed him because he asked for wisdom instead of earthly things. God blessed him with earthly things as well. And so we know those stories. So he's appeared to him twice, and Solomon still turned away from him. But the question is, why did God leave Solomon any of the kingdom? And it explains it right here. So what did he say? in honor of his father, David. And why would he do that? We know David messed up all the time. David couldn't build the temple because of the fact that he was a man of the sword, and God told him, no, you're not going to build my temple. So why would he save this little portion for David? Because in the end, we know he was a man after God's own heart, right? So we know that God's relationship with David, David's relationship with God was a good one in the end. And to the point that God loved David enough to preserve this lineage for David. And we're going to talk a little more about that later on. So we'll just go ahead and do it right now. Why? Later on in history, why is it going to be important that God didn't just tell Solomon, like he had done some others, you're done. Your family's done. Why did he go ahead and, what's the important to us today of the fact that he went ahead and let Judah belong to Solomon's lineage? Okay, that's exactly right, because we know God had made David a promise, don't we? And if God wipes, let me rephrase this. What happens to kings' families, to royal families, when there's a change in power? Many times. Yes, they do. So that's that throughout history, and that's not a Jewish thing. That's a world thing. When there is an exchange of power, many times the royal family is totally wiped out. I mean, even as we go back about 150 years to the Soviet Union, to Russia, and you have an overthrow of power. A royal family is taken out. What do? They take out the whole family, including the children, and they did what? They shot them. They killed them. Because you don't want that threat to still be there. And so you destroy that family as totally as you can so that there's nobody that has a legitimate claim to your throne. And so God knew he had made a promise to David, and if he allowed Jeroboam, who we know is not a good person based on the actions he takes, to take over everything, there's a good chance the end of Solomon's line would have come, and that would have been the end of David's line, and then it would have hindered God in his promise. I don't ever want to say God couldn't have done it, but yes, sir. Yeah, I'm trying to find that. He said, you shall not, yeah, but you're right, because he had given them very specific instructions to wipe out. It's kind of the same thing we're talking about with the royal family, isn't it? Go in and wipe them out, because if you leave any, there's going to be problems. And we've talked about this before. That seems really harsh of God, but we have to remember that God's the creator. We're the created. And when God decides that he needs to wipe something out, he has that right. He created us, and he can do that. And it's not our place to stand in judgment of God when those things happen. It's hard for us to see it that way because that's not how we feel, that's not how we think. But we've got to keep in mind that when God tells somebody, when he told the Israelites to wipe out everything, including children, livestock, wives, women, the whole thing, as harsh as that sounds to us, there was a purpose, and this is part of his purpose. It comes back to get them. So I appreciate you pointing that out, Brent. Yes, that is correct. So we see that God at this time has mercy on David, on Solomon through David, or on David through Solomon. I'm not sure which. I'd have to think about my English right there. But anyway, he's having mercy on these guys and leaves them with the tribe. If you look at it, he says, I'm going to leave you one tribe. But then as you read through the story, it's 10 tribes of the northern kingdom and 2 tribes of the southern kingdom. And so he ends up with Judah and Benjamin. And we don't necessarily have to go through that, but those are the 2 that he leaves him. The problem is that both of these kingdoms end up being what? And we talked about this a little bit last week. We didn't get into the details, but what happens to both the northern kingdom, which they began to call Israel, and the southern kingdom? 10 tribes of the north was Israel. Two tribes were in the south. They called them Judah or Judea. But what happened to both? Okay, over time, they both are destroyed, or they're both taken into captivity, right? They're both taken into captivity. And as you look through this, and I think that Logan will go through this some, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about details. Why were they taken into captivity? The north went first. They got about 170 to 200 years of being their own little kingdom of Israel, and then they were taken over by Assyria, 722 BC. Why were both kingdoms in the end destroyed or put into captivity? Absolutely, because of evil rulers. They both, after Solomon, had horrible kings. If you look in your Bibles, it tells you, chapter 12, at the very end of 11, the last verse says, "Then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam was his son reigned in his place." And then it goes into chapter 12, it goes into the story of Rehoboam, and the fact that, let's just read a little bit of it here. Chapter 12, "And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam and said, 'Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdens and service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you.'" And then it goes through the story. If you remember last week, what happens here? Yeah, Rehoboam decides to convene his councils of wisdom. And he has one that were a lot of the men that had been around his father. They were the older crew. They were people who had been there a long time. Does anybody remember what advice they gave Rehoboam? Yeah, hey, lighten their yoke right here. You've got a chance to make a good impression, right? There's always, when we have a change, even here in our country, when you have a change in power and president and party, if you didn't like what was going on, there's a chance for that party to make things better, at least for a short period of time. And that's how it was here. He had this opportunity. And the people around him were saying, hey, do it. We'll be okay. Go ahead. Lower their taxes. Make the yoke on them a little less. Win them over. But he had a second group. And the second group was a bunch of guys that it says they grew up with him. They were his age. They were his friends. And I think this kind of comes back to what Jesse was talking about with some of the wives around him. What do you think these young men around him were thinking? I mean, they gave him bad advice, didn't they? They came in and said, no, don't do that. You got to prove how strong you are. Is this not typical 20-year-old male? And I don't know how old he was. He's got to be in his 30s or 40s, because we know that Solomon reigned for 40 years. So it may actually tell us. I haven't dug through there to find his age. It wasn't including this. But, young men have a tendency to want to be macho. I've gotten old. I'm not macho anymore. I don't care. If it's cold, I'm putting on a coat. I'm not going out in my short sleeves. That's gotten old. But I think it's made me wiser. But these young men, they want to be strong. And my guess is they saw an opportunity as well. Not just for Rehoboam, but now they get to be his counselors, his advisors. Let's be strong. And then they're all going to participate in this power with him. And their advice to him is, let's find it. Then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, "Thus you should speak to the people who have spoken to you, saying, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us.' Thus you shall say to them, 'My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I'll add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges.'" And I think some of them say scorpions. And so Jeroboam And all the people came to Rehoboam the third day. Anyway, it continues on. The young men told him, not only are you going to make their yoke, you're going to tell them how much greater you are than Solomon. Did Solomon have a pretty good reputation at that time with the world? Correct. He did with his wisdom. It talks about, I know Logan last week talked about how much gold he had, how many tons of gold they had. In the Bible, it talks about that Solomon had made silver just common in the streets of Jerusalem. And just how many horses he had. I think, what did he say last week? Was it 700 chariots, 7,000 horses? I can't remember the exact number. 1,200? I can't remember the exact number. I'm shooting from the hip here. But he had all these things, and they said that, that he had become great among the rulers of the world. And so you have this mighty king, and were the Israelites proud of that? Absolutely they were. They're still proud of it. If you talk to a Jew who can trace their lineage and does the whole, they're still proud of King David and King Solomon. And so they were proud of that. And these young men came in, and instead of just riding those coattails and just continuing on a good thing, these young men want to come in and tell him, you've got to be even greater than your dad. This is the kind of stuff that leads to what? Well, we see what happens here, but even in the world today, it leads to war, doesn't it? Almost always leads to war, because some young buck comes in and thinks he's got to go conquer. And when people decide they got to conquer, that means other people have to die. And so it's never a good thing. Yes, sir. If y'all couldn't hear his story there, he was talking about the fact that when he was working for Bell Helicopter, that this kind of happened, where you had a group of older men who really were running things well, and then you had a group of younger men that came in and just had a bunch of changes they wanted to make, and that things didn't go real well for them based on those changes. And I'm not going to say, we've all been around enough to know that sometimes change can be good. There are good changes. You can't make progress if you don't have some changes. But so often things like this happen where it becomes an us versus them, a young versus old, our generation versus your generation, to the point we even name generations, boomer and the greatest generations, what I'm always going to call them. Generation X, Generation Z, millennials, we label each other and then we gripe at each other. So anyway, that's something that's been going on forever. All right, let me see if there's anything else that I just want to cover specifically. The southern kingdom, lasted an extra about 140 years. They didn't go into captivity until 586 BC. So they got an extra 140 years than the north kingdom had. Does anybody know why the south survived a little longer than the north? Absolutely. If you read through the history of the kings of the southern kingdom, you start coming up with some good kings. You have Rehoboam. Okay, so the north, Israel had Jeroboam. Jeroboam immediately, it says there's a story that he cast two golden calves, which we know where that story harkens back to. And he started setting up places of idol worship throughout his country in the north. We see that happens immediately, and really they never recover from that. Rehoboam in the south starts to do the same thing. It says he started to set up idol worship places of worship on the high places for those different religious groups. His son came in and continued it for 3 years, and then his son was taken out of power, and you had a King Asa, A-S-A, that came in. And King Asa started to restore the old ways. He tried to turn the people back to God. And then his son, I believe, was, unless I'm wrong, he's Jehoshaphat. Jumping Jehoshaphat. Don't know where that comes from, but that's what I think every time I hear it. Jehoshaphat continued the positive ways of Asa. But then again, as things happened, their sons on down the line turned away from God again. And periodically you would have, if you find a list of the kings of the southern kingdom, you can actually find lists online that say this one was good, this one was bad, this one was good. You can find it in the Bible if you take the time to find the scriptures, that's right. But I mean, there are people who have come in and made these charts, and it's the kings of the north are bad, 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 bad captivity. In the south, it's good, good, it's bad, bad, good, good, bad, 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 good, worst ever. I think that was Manasseh. You know, and so you get this list of kings, but the south had some that tried. They had some that tried to bring them back to God, and when they started to turn back to God, all of a sudden, the southern kingdom would begin to prosper. And all of a sudden, God would bless that nation because they had a ruler who was doing well. And so, in the end, though, it turned negative, and the south was taken as well. And so, you look up and you see that about 350 to 400 years after Solomon's gone, so is the kingdom of Israel. It's been both the north and the south have been taken into captivity. So I kind of want to change gears a little bit. If you'll turn with me to Matthew, and y'all will have to stay with me because so I was told I was going to do this like, I don't know, Wednesday. And I sat down Friday and started a lesson, and then we were out of town yesterday, and we were supposed to get back yesterday at a decent hour, and there was, if y'all don't know, there was a big fire outside of Wichita Falls, and it shut the roads down for a couple hours, and we get back last night about 10:30. I start looking over my lesson. I go, I don't like this, so I scrapped it and started over. And so if this doesn't make sense, it's midnight me, and I apologize for that. So, but I think if you'll stay with me, you'll see where I'm headed here. So we're going to Matthew chapter 18. And if I could have someone read verses 21 through 35. Matthew 18, 21 through 35. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. So we know this parable is the parable of the unforgiving servant, or the poor servant or something. I can't remember exactly what, as I was reading this and doing some research on it. But what I want to focus on is, this is Jesus telling a story. And Jesus told parables. Why did Jesus tell parables? Because people could understand them, because they're real, so people could relate to them. And as I was looking for some of the teachings of the New Testament and Jesus that can kind of parallel some of the things that were happening, this one hit me. I don't know why, but it did. Because as you read this story and you look at King Solomon, there's some similarities. Because David and Solomon, and especially Solomon, it says Solomon was in the presence of God twice, right? God visited him twice. So Solomon had been given a great gift. What had this servant been given? Forgiveness. And it says it was a great amount. Let me go see. How much was it? He owed, 10,000. And basically, when you look that up, he's not going to be able to repay that. I don't know how he got into that debt, because Jesus didn't care. That's not the point of the story. But he's got this huge debt, and his master forgives him. And we think, if we put ourselves in those shoes, my wife and I, we've got college debt because we had 3 boys that we put through a private school. And that's okay. We're going to pay it off over time. But how do you think, and so I'm not trying to get political here, how do you think I'd feel if that was totally forgiven? You right? We can go on vacation. Because I would have this sense of joy, of thankfulness. I'm one of those old folks. I might even write somebody a thank you note, a handwritten thank you note, and mail it. But there would be great joy in our household if we were forgiven all that college debt. And so I kind of can relate to this guy a little bit. But he's forgiven his debt, and he immediately does what? This doesn't even talk about him having time. Well, it doesn't say how long it was, but it does say that he goes out and does what? What's he do? He finds somebody that owes him not even close to the same amount. Not even close to the same amount. Now, it may have been for that servant. 100 may have been just as much to pay off as that 10,000 was for him. That's kind of the way we see it. That servant is desperate and can't pay that 100. But instead of treating him the same way he had been treated, instead of showing him mercy and kindness, he starts to choke him and think, does he have him thrown in prison? Is that a different story? Has him tortured, yeah, has him tortured. I knew there was another one down there. So he chokes him. Anyway, he does not show kindness. He does not show mercy. How does this parallel to David and Solomon, and especially Solomon, and what Solomon had happened with him? We see both of them have been given a great gift. Solomon was given wisdom. He was given earthly power and wealth because he had had a good heart. He had done some good things. So God blessed Solomon greatly. The master in this story blesses this servant by forgiving him his debts. And yet, what do both of them do? Yeah, Solomon taxes the people beyond what they can pay. But he did what? He got the kingdom taken because he did what? He forsook God. He turned from God. His heart changed. He had been given a great gift. He'd been given wisdom. He'd been given power. He had lived a godly life, but then his heart changed. And he turned from God, and he didn't continue. God had given him a great gift. He didn't pass that along to his people, did he? It says that he made their yoke heavy. He made their life hard. God made his life easy. He made their lives hard. This servant goes out, gets forgiven this great debt, could be apparently thrown in prison and tortured for this debt until he pays it off. And yet, when he's given the opportunity to pass this on, to continue the good things that his master had done for him, he chooses to ignore and he has the guy thrown in prison, and then he gets himself thrown in prison, doesn't he? And it says in verse 35, this is the key verse of the parable, before we get all off on comparisons that I'm making. Verse 35 says, so my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespass. So when we look at this story, sometimes we look at King Solomon and we see the story of the two kingdoms, and we're sitting there in the pews listening to Logan tell us about the history behind it, but we forget about the heart behind it. We forget about the story behind it that actually has significant meaning to us today. And that significant meaning is that if we are blessed by God and yet we turn away from God, what's going to happen? You reap what you sow. There's going to be negative consequences, aren't there? There's always negative consequences for actions that go against the will of God. So there's three lessons that I really want to talk about from this story about this divided kingdom. And the first one is just that, okay? Well, actually, I've already given it away, but we'll go through these questions anyway. How does Peter, and then I want to go to John. Let's go to Luke. I want to bring Peter into this. Luke chapter 22. This is a story y'all are all extremely familiar with. Luke 22, verses 54 through 62. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him to the high priest's house, him being Jesus. But Peter followed at a distance. And now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, this man was also with him. But he denied him, saying, woman, I do not know him. And after a little while, another saw him and said, you also are of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And this verse is maybe the worst one in the Bible for me. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. I get emotional just talking about it. Can you imagine? I know how I feel when I disappoint God. I know how I feel when I know that I've sinned. I've done the wrong thing. But I don't have to look Jesus eye to eye when it happens. And I cannot imagine the look it says that he looked. Turned and looked at Peter. And, I want to believe, and I do believe that probably Jesus looked at him with sadness in his eyes. But can you imagine if every time we committed a sin, we had to look Jesus in the eyes, knowing that we put him on that cross, knowing that we denied him? Anyway, it's a powerful story. And so anyway, it says, Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and he wept bitterly. But that's not the end of the story. Let's turn to John chapter 21. This is actually the beauty of the story. John chapter 21. And find verses 15 through 19. So when they had eaten breakfast, and of course this is after the resurrection, and Jesus is back with his disciples, it says, so when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hand, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. So we see here, Peter had to face God, had to face Jesus when he made a mistake. And yet Jesus, in the end, comes back. Why does he do this? Why does he talk to Peter like this? This seems kind of redundant. Of course, as a kid, I didn't understand this. Like, well, Jesus, why are you asking Peter these questions? You sound like one of my high school teachers. Why are you asking this question? Same thing 3 times. Why does Jesus do this for Peter? Okay. It was to encourage him what? Okay. It's to encourage him that Jesus still loves him, he still loves Jesus, that it's going to be good. What else? How is Peter kind of like Solomon? Both of them had a great relationship with God, didn't they? Peter walked with God. He walked with Jesus. Solomon, in his early days, walked with God. When it got hard, though, as Solomon got old, he turned from God. And in a hard, difficult time, Peter did what? Peter turned from God. At the moment, he denied God because of what? Because of fear. If you stop and you think about it, Solomon turned, and it says it's because of the people he had around him, right? Because he found himself in a bad situation around people who didn't worship God. And Solomon gave into that. Peter finds himself, even though he's trying, let's don't be too hard on Peter. Peter followed Jesus. The rest of them ran. But Peter's in this crew, and he finds himself in a bad crew, a bad group of people. He's with the wrong people. And again, it causes him to do something that he wouldn't normally do, which is he denies Christ, right? And so we see where these guys, what I'm trying to get you to see is we are just like this, aren't we? We want to point fingers at Solomon and say, Solomon, you had this wisdom. You got to talk to God. You got to have this relationship and had all these blessings, and then you gave it up. We want to say, Peter, you walked with Jesus. How could you deny him? Absolutely. There's sins of commission and sins of omission. I can't remember which one that would be, but when you're silent and you don't speak up when you have a chance, that's wrong also, and I agree. But we're talking about, the lessons to be learned from this divided kingdom, and the first one that we talked about is the fact that there's always going to be a consequence to your actions when you turn from God. The beauty of it is, through these 2 stories, we also see that the second big lesson we can take from this is the fact that God continues to move back to rebellious people. God continues to move back. He moves towards people with rebellious hearts. He goes and searches them out, and he's the one who tries to make it right if we will only allow him to do so. We saw where he gave a grace and a kindness to Solomon and to David because he allowed them to keep 2 tribes and to have a southern kingdom for their lineage. And we see where Jesus goes back to Peter and specifically restores his faith, restores him, lets him know you're okay. I'm okay with you. I forgive you. The things that you've done, we're going to move through. We're going to move past. And not only that, Peter, you're going to do great things. And when we look at the Bible and we look at these stories, and I'm always talking about it, we put ourselves into these stories instead of being judgmental and saying, oh, that person's about you or whatever. Peter's one of my favorite people because I'm Peter. How many times have I let God down, and thank goodness he can't look me in the eye. My dad used to do that to me. My dad was not a yeller or a screamer. He's 6'4", big guy. I was kind of scared of him. And y'all have heard me say that before. But he was a gentle person. And when I did something wrong, he could look at me and I knew, but that's not Jesus. I can't imagine. So the thing I want you to get out of this lesson today, there's really 3. The first one is that there are consequences for actions when we turn from God. The second one is that God will seek out those of us who have made mistakes. He will offer grace, and he will offer restoration to us when we make mistakes. And then the third one is that, and I didn't have time to get to all the details on it, but God's will prevail. And we look at the story of Solomon, and we know the reason that he allowed that to happen, that he allowed the kingdom to exist, was because he had made a promise to David, and it's the promise that saves us. It's the fact that through the lineage of David came Jesus. And then for Peter and the New Testament crew, when Jesus dies and he's resurrected, that is God's plan for us, to save us. And so no matter how goofy, bad, or I think one of the words was stupid, that the men are and the women are in the world, God's will prevail. What God wants to be done will be done. He'll find a way. And so those are the three things I want you to take from this lesson this morning. Thank you for being here.